Coming up, with 2 preseason games down, what are some of the areas of concern that Steve Nash and this coaching staff will need to address as we round out the preseason, hit the regular season, and ultimately look for the Brooklyn Nets to have success and be a playoff threat this season?
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
That's right, friends. It's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. Give him a follow on Twitter, @Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And Doug, no time for pleasantries, because we have serious concerns around the Brooklyn Nets. We're 2 games in to the preseason, but there are areas that we want to make sure get addressed as we approach this regular season.
Yeah, there's no preseason game. The third one is until Thursday, so there's some time here in between, which I thought was a pretty long layoff, but whatever. Until they get this next game in. Yes. But in the meantime, I know we started the last game off with some positives, which is hard to do. You have to dig deep when you get absolutely crushed by a team, and start off with positives that the team had, and then we address some concerns. But I think we wanted to just take a beat after having watched these 2 first preseason games, being able to talk about them in totality around like what we've seen. Because the last time we talked, obviously, was about a post-game wrap-up. We're coming in hot right after the game ends and trying to just share, sometimes as many thoughts as possible. In this one, I think we're going to take a kind of closer look at how the first 2 games mesh together and what concerns there remain and probably will continue to remain as they go through the preseason and then into the regular season.
Yeah. These are themes that I think we could have brought up last year or the year prior or the year before that, in terms of some of the areas mentioned Steve Nash and the coaching staff at the top, right? Making sure that this team is going to gel. But now that you add in what we feel like is such a key ingredient to Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving with Ben Simmons, you start to, through 2 games, say, yes, on paper and based on skill sets, a lot of things can go really well for Brooklyn. However, this is where we start. Ben Simmons' overall game, and maybe most specifically the offensive end, is something that needs to come to fruition here if we're going to be bullish about this team in the regular season.
Yeah, it's really just the only way it kind of works, right? The only way this thing in Brooklyn is going to work long-term is for Simmons to fit in, like you're seeing on YouTube, to fit in all around, specifically on offense with these guys. And I think through 2 games, we've seen glimmers of it without really seeing anything to take a ton of solace in going forward. Now, look, we are team. It's been more than a year with Ben Simmons. Like no one has spoken about that more, has put that in more as caveats around they're talking about the team than we have with Simmons. I'm totally aware of it. We have said it multiple times. That being said, you really do have to kind of squint to see it early on in terms of how his game is meshing or not meshing with the overall offensive unit. And, with the superstars, I know Kyrie wasn't there last game, with the shooters, how they're planning to sort of use him as an attacker and how he's going to be able to, sort of operate against opposing defenses. I am still very much on the side of patience here. And it's really only patience on the offensive end that's being positive, because we really just haven't seen much. I'll go into some specifics here in a second, but like in general, you've had to sort of use Simmons' past to be positive about his present, right?
Yeah.
Because what we've seen through the first 2 games, specifically on offense, has not given you tons and tons to really be hopeful for, and with the understanding that it's still very early.
Yeah, in some ways, the part of his game that's always been instinctual, the thing that you can say he's known for, the defensive end. First 2 preseason games, that's where he felt and looked most comfortable, right? It just very fluid, going out and attacking. We talked about getting some steals from behind on certain possessions, and then also thinking about how it makes it easier for other players on that end of the court. Great. Put that to the side. The problem is offensively, as you highlighted last game, and I know a lot of fans were voicing concerns or at least wondering about, was, hey, if this is a guy not just after he gets over half court, but when he's actually all the way to the offensive end of the floor, if this is a guy that's going to pick up his dribble at times, if he's someone that maybe is going to need an outlet more frequently than you would like to see in terms of ball handling, that's going to start to develop a problem. And I think when we were talking coming into this episode, you were also speaking to the idea of how him and Kevin Durant are going to interact. I wanted to get your take on it because the second that you said it, I had an immediate trigger thought of where the concerns start to arise with consistency. And I wonder if we end up in the same place.
Okay, so yeah, I'll come on to the Durant thing in a second, but just some high-level stuff here from Simmons to start. He's taken 9 total shots in 44 and a half minutes. That's
cool.
Not good enough. It's not good enough. And we all know his limitations on the offensive end when it comes to the shot. That's been much talked about, and we don't need to relitigate that here. 9 total shots from a guy who makes this much and this important to the team. It's just too easy to defend, right? We're already seeing it highlighted here. Defenses are able to sag off him or to really pressure him to force him to pick up the dribble, which is what he did. I actually don't mind too much the sagging because Simmons has shown in the past that if he gets ahead of steam to the basket, he can actually make you punish you for that style of defense against him. The problem is he hasn't done that at all, right?
Yeah.
He's taken the shots have mostly been just right at the basket. He had one floater that he hit last game, which you're like, oh, and you should never get excited about a floater. But with Simmons, you do because he's taken so few shots that at some point you got to get excited for whatever you're given.
And so he looked uncomfortable in the other instances
totally
there around the paint too, right? The push shots, he looks like a guy that could barely even want to do those in instances. We're not talking about perimeter shots, mid-range game. We're talking about a specific offensive scoring area that should be second nature for him.
And glass half full where that is, it's still early. He's still getting his feet wet. He hasn't played more than half a year plus. Those the ways that we've talked about it. The glass half empty part of that is he doesn't want to take contact because he's afraid of what happens at the free throw line. Well documented, over 2 in the preseason so far. Does not, mentally does not want to go to the free throw line, which is going to inhibit you from getting to the basket because you don't want to get contact, right? If it's going to be easy for guys to be super aggressive with you around the basket because they don't think you want to be fouled, because you don't want to go to the free throw line to showcase maybe a deficiency in your game, then that would end up being a long-term concern. I'm not saying it is now, but there's enough of a history here to say after 2 games, you can start attaching some of it, right? Maybe not all of it, but some of it to what has happened to him in the past. And I guess let me put it this way. I would feel a ton better about this if he was getting to the basket, getting fouled, and missing all his free throws. That actually wouldn't be
aggression
a concern
is there.
To me.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be if he was being aggressive, getting fouled, and the efficiency was terrible, and he was just trying kind of new things, and he was not afraid to just miss shots at the free throw line. I actually don't think I would bring up free throw shooting as a concern, right? But the problem is going the other direction with it. If that's not going to be the case, it will end up, and we've already seen this, being too easy on the defense. It'll just be too easy. It becomes a non-entity. His great skill, of which I believe him to be elite at, is getting into the paint, reading and reacting, and finding shooters. And if they're not there, trying to finish at the rim, which he has done in the past. If the first thing can't happen if there's no threat of the second thing. And so I think, again, 44 minutes, that's not even a full game if you played every minute. So it's early. But because these are some holdover issues from him in the past, I do start to get concerned that these will continue to hold over. And I probably will get increasingly concerned every time it doesn't happen because there will be a time when time just starts to run out on that.
And there's something to it. We talk about areas that the coaching staff needs to figure out and address here. I wonder about how you start to try to manufacture what feels like even those looks that we say, when the opportunities are there and you're one-on-one, you're in the paint, you have to go look for that shot. You have to go to look to be aggressive. I wonder the difference between manufacturing the opportunities that look a little bit more like Ben Simmons faced up, getting downhill transition opportunities where it's that let's remove the hesitation. Let's remove the mental part of this and make it something where your natural athleticism and instincts are going to take over, as opposed to offensive sets where he ends up with the ball in a position to take a look that he doesn't necessarily want to do. So there's that piece of it. And then I think the next phase of this we want to talk about, we mentioned the tie-in with Kevin Durant. this is
Oh,
not
yeah,
a
sorry.
one-to-one.
Didn't answer
No,
that.
no, it's okay. I know we're going to get to that, but no, I'm going to frame it this way because I want to get into that next. Is just that to say we had talked about how one of the areas of Ben Simmons' game that works really well offensively in the absence now of James Harden is the facilitator role, setting guys up. Here's the problem, and this isn't a shock. James Harden, different other set of offensive skills, right? So when you think about the idea of, well, what if Ben Simmons is setting everybody up beautifully and everyone's getting their spots? That's great. And also, it cannot be the sole thing that he does offensively. This offensive game in and around the basket needs to be effective because it impacts not only someone like Nicholas Claxton and his role inside of this offense, but then as we'll talk about in a second, I think the way that Kevin Durant is going to function as well. Just the best version of how this team is potent and consistent on that end of the floor.
For sure. And actually, I'll give the exact anti-analog, whatever that is, the opposite of the Harden thing here in a second. First, got to talk to you about our friends over at LinkedIn. These days, every potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. You like to hear that word. You add your job to the purple hiring, the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile. You spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions, they make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience. You can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire because that's ultimately the goal. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
So one of the areas when we start to look here at Ben Simmons and tying him into Kevin Durant, I'll just say, because we end up sometimes on the same page about this. My concern is that we talked about ISO ball and we batted this around in the second game where I just said, I don't want to see a lot of Kevin Durant ISO ball in preseason game number 2. There's plenty to work on. Some of that feels like one of those things where you go, well, if the offense is stagnating, why don't we go ahead and let Kevin Durant get into his ISO setups and score some buckets? Go back to last postseason, things looked really difficult against the Boston Celtics and what defenses can do. If Ben Simmons is not a consistent threat offensively, you can't afford to take one and then maybe two, when we're talking about Nicholas Claxton being the starting rotation, weapons or options away, and then say, let's play a little 3-on-5 and see how things work here.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, I think we mentioned, I can't remember, maybe we mentioned this last time that I don't mind Kevin Durant isolation because Kevin Durant
you push back
like
on that a little bit.
Yeah, but in general, yes, on a high level, like we are concerned with like overall, this is the second concern is like how the overall ball handling or lack thereof in certain situations leads to this other thing, which is like late possession bailouts, right? Yep. And they had other ones where like they needed bailouts at the end of possession where it doesn't even get to Durant. And that's like really bad when you got Kessler Edwards jacking up threes and stuff like that. Like that's suicide. The literal opposite of like Kevin Durant isolation. Like whatever the opposite of Kevin Durant isolation, it probably looks like a Kessler Edwards above the break heave at the end of the shot clock. Like that's around the exact opposite place you want to be. The hope with Simmons here was that he was going to be more of a facilitator and connector. I do believe that will still be the case. He does clearly understand these angles and understands this stuff. Obviously, it will look different with Kyrie Irving back and with Joe Harris back and Seth Curry back, like sort of like the exact guys that he needs, right? Those guys weren't there. The team is built for those guys to play a lot of minutes. When they're not there, it's going to look worse. There's just no way around it, right? It just would look worse for anybody when you have that many minutes and skills tied up in being on the bench and away and not playing. It's just, there's no way it can look better. Like that's just pretty simple math. That being said, the difference with Harden's ability to facilitate at times, and no one's ever comparing Harden to Simmons, believe me, or Simmons to Harden. But Harden wanted that contact, right? Yeah. Like Harden annoyingly wanted the contact at times. Where they had to basically make new rules. Like they had to basically make new rules because of how badly he wanted to get fouled. And the NBA had to institute a whole new set of guidelines because of him and a couple other dudes who was like, okay, do we need to see your arms? Just gesticulate up into the air for the 3,000th time here in the game? Yeah. Like, no, I don't think so. But the reason he was able to facilitate so well in this offense is because he invited the contact, you actually couldn't do anything. The defense then had no out. Because Simmons doesn't want it, his ball handling actually gets mitigated even more. And they really don't have a ton of guys on their roster to do it, which is something they didn't have last year either. And it was a problem. And so when you say getting bogged down, I think getting bogged down is the thing that looks like bogged down iso ball sometimes is a definitive byproduct of not having their ball handler and probably, frankly, coaching. Like Nash and company are accountable here for sure in terms of trying to get these guys into the best positions.
And this is where I think it becomes interesting because so if you think about Ben Simmons struggling to get into rhythm offensively, one of the ways to produce that, to your point, when 100% healthy, well, okay, let's spread out the floor, let's create these pockets, and let's look to get Ben Simmons on some slashes, on some backdoor cuts to the basket, where his process is simply catch and put it down, right? Like those are some of the easy ways to make sure that his offensive game is still benefiting you. The drawback there is, that means that you're taking the ball out of his hands in order to get to that point in the offense. So if it's not Kyrie Irving, we said before, right? Joe Harris, that's not a part of his bag. Seth Curry certainly has some of it, but you don't want to have to rely on that. And then coming out of that last preseason game, we posed the question, hey, is Edmund Sumner getting closer to pushing Patty Mills here for a role than we maybe initially would have thought? If that's the case, this is probably what you're going to want to see in the last preseason game and early in the regular season is what is Edmund Sumner as a ball handler and facilitator. We know it's not the 1A of his game, but if he can show enough of that, then it means what you do is you start to create these instances where inside of starting unit, going into the second unit, you can have two other ball handler-ish players on the floor in addition to Ben Simmons. That can change the dynamic here, but it doesn't mean that I have confidence in any one of those players. And I know we're going to talk about coming up here in a second, our third biggest concern, the size issue. I'm going to have a little bit of a subplot to that as well when we head to the regular season. But for me, and I know we disagree, quote unquote, but I look at ball handling as being the biggest concern here over everything else right now. Ball handling and the way in which Steve Nash has his ball handlers set up and run this offense. That's the thing that they need to figure out the most here, because with this much athleticism and talent on the roster, you can mitigate whether or not Ben Simmons is ready to pull the trigger all the time by playing at pace, having strong offensive sets, and having movement off ball that creates spacing for you. So there's going to be a point here where we're going to have the chicken or egg argument about, is it the players that aren't functioning properly here, or is it something people talked about last season, Steve Nash and the coaching staff not setting them up to have easy success?
And we already know there's a certain subset of fan that believes it's all Nash.
Right, and I would push back on that.
Yeah, but it's definitely some Nash, if not,
it can't be 100% one or the other. Yeah,
more than even we've talked about. Like there has to be a push here to have we don't need to be calling plays. Like I know you need to have definitive sets and like ideas around their structure around their offense. That one is going to have it needs much more motion in it. We've already seen this. Like at times when they come out of the gate, and I think they've actually been this has been dictated to them early, where early on in the games, there's significant movement on offense, right? Like they are slashing behind stuff. They've run some double drags. Like they are, they're like cutting back to the out behind, not back cutting. They're moving in and out back to the 3-point line behind screens so that they can get open 3-point shots, which they got a lot of. So I think there's definitively an offense running here. I don't think anyone that wants to say they're just kind of going down there and playing street ball, it's just not correct. But some of it breaks down when Simmons picks up his dribble for sure. Like that's a death knell for any offense. But two, there has to be among the coaching staff they just have to like keep their foot on the gas with the movement part all the time. Like it can't ever slow down because they are doing it. Like if you go back and watch the early parts of these games, they're clearly running lots of motion, lots of just like kind of handoff motions around the top of the arc, because that's going to open up stuff. They did a ton of that, but it kind of starts going away as time goes on. Maybe it's preseason and everyone kind of just gets a little comfortable with what they're doing, but there clearly is a motion aspect to their offense that is paying dividends. And again, they missed a ton of wide open threes to start these two games. Go ahead.
And I was going to say too, that was giving my final point kind of on this. And this goes to coaching, it goes to the players as well, though. And maybe at the highest level for Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and the superstars on this team, is you cannot fall victim to the idea of all the motion, all the movement off ball, all of these sets. Because the shots don't go down, it does not mean that it was not the right play to be running, right? Like there has to be a level of stick-to-itiveness to, hey, when these shots start to fall, not they're not falling, let's go somewhere else. When they start to fall, that's going to be a potent offense. It's going to open up these other opportunities. So again, we're talking preseason games here, but that I think is what happened last season, these last couple seasons. When things weren't going well, it makes sense for someone like Kevin Durant, for someone like Kyrie Irving, for James Harden when he's here to go, all right, if it's not working as a unit, maybe I'll do it myself. Because guess what? I am capable of that. The problem is then you don't have the consistency to get back to what is going to be effective over 48 minutes, what's effective over the course of a season.
And that's just what we saw, right? So that's exactly what we saw. And it's on the coaches to cure that, right? Like it's on the coaches to instill confidence in a scheme that will get over that. I don't like subscribe to the idea that the Nets don't run plays. Like that's not true. But I know people want to say that, but there is, I think stylistically, there is a style that they want to play here having to do with more motion. Now, when that goes away, it is on Nash and company to make sure it doesn't go away, right? Like to put everyone in the best chances to succeed. I do think we'll see more of that. I wonder if our tenor would be a little different had 6 more of these open threes gone down, right? Like would we, I'm not sure we'd be having some of the same concerns.
Joe Harris, Kyrie Irving playing.
Yeah, they just didn't go down. Like they just didn't go in. Like they just have shot really poorly from 3. With a lot of them being, I would say, very good looks. So we'll get into the size thing, which is everyone's other thing that they always want to talk about with the Nets, and probably rightfully so to some degree. First, we're going to talk about our friends over at betonline.net, your number one source for football betting info this season, coming off Sunday of football. We'll be back again next Sunday, obviously, Bet Online. To find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. Football, the NFL too, CFB, it's all there on Bet Online, your continued source for all your sports wagering information. They got live betting, up to the minute scores. It's all there. Maybe MLB as you roll through the playoffs, MMA, boxing, golf. You head on over to betonline.net. Use your mobile device to learn more. Bet Online, where the game starts.
So our final talking point here that we wanted to get to is obviously the size component for the Brooklyn Nets, and something that you mentioned there. Fans are constantly talking about. They need to be trading for Miles Turner. Why didn't we trade for Miles Turner in the middle of the second preseason game while a shot was going up from Ben Simmons that wasn't looking good and he was going to go to the foul line and struggle? This is the one thing I want to fold this into around the need for size, or whether or not we think there's a need for size. It's not just in the front court. This also goes back to ball handlers, facilitators, and size in the backcourt as well. Because when we talk about a guy like Patty Mills, when we talk about watching Cam Thomas play, when we talk about all these other small guards on this roster, it was one of the things that we highlighted and liked about Edmund Sumner. When it gets into a position where the offense is running well and he ends up on a backdoor cut, well, his size and length affords him the ability to get at the basket and attack and finish, probably, we think, with a higher percentage. Getting to the foul line still matters. It's still important, obviously. But I think sometimes we get caught up in saying size is solely about rebounds and not getting beaten up by, Joel Embiid in the playoffs. No, it matters across the board. So it's a consistent potential concern here. I don't put it number one, but you maybe see it as being the glaring issue that could be a plague for the Nets here.
I wouldn't call it glaring. I agree. I agree in the sentiment that like the Nets are just a bigger team this year, functionally bigger. They had bigger guys last year, but like some of those guys were complete stiffs and like they really couldn't play them for long periods of time. They're already a bigger team this year. That's a good. I think you put that really well. Like across the board, functionally they are bigger. They can play some of these guys, Simmons, Royce O'Neal. Obviously, getting Harris back makes them a little bigger as opposed to like having to play Seth and Kyrie together and stuff, right? Like, so just already they're getting a little bigger across the board. Where they didn't get bigger is at the very, far end of the archetype, the 5 archetype, which is to say like the traditional starting center, right? Last year it was Andre Drummond. Before that it was DeAndre Jordan. And they haven't really employed these kinds of centers. I think mostly that's good. You don't really want a lot of these guys in your team. It's very obvious why. They never can play together. Like just for starters, that's why you don't want a lot of them on the team. Any guy that's a traditional 5 cannot play with another traditional 5. So all of a sudden you're just kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater in terms of like who can even play together. we also people. It's so funny because like Patty Mills gets dragged a ton for what he couldn't do in the Boston series, right? Which is true. Everyone forgets that Drummond couldn't do anything either, but for some reason they all want a Drummond back, right? Like Drummond was
right. That's
totally useless.
Point.
Like he was totally
Great
useless
point.
he was totally useless in that series. Nobody seems to care. They just dropped coverage them to death, and the Nets went home but everyone only looks at the Mills part of that. Again, it was correct. Like Mills was getting completely torched, but Drummond was. If you remember toward the end of that series, we were just losing our minds that Drummond was even still starting. Remember, we were like, we got to start Claxton. We're like, it's malpractice for Drummond to be still starting.
Staff.
Again, it gets totally forgotten. It gets totally forgotten in the conversations when everyone wants to bring in a Dwight Howard or a Boogie Cousins, which is everyone's favorite. So like, I would just pump the brakes and just try to rethink real quick back on why you want this. Like, these guys will never play in the playoffs. How bad does it really matter? The second thing is about Miles Turner. That's the other one that everyone wants to go to. And now like Mo Bamba too. There's a reason there's one guy who ever gets brought up with a stretch five like that's available. One guy. It's Miles Turner. That's it. And to some degree Mo Bamba. That's the whole list. There's 30 teams in the NBA. That's the whole list that anyone can ever come up with of stretch five centers that would fit good on the Nets. Great. Those guys are fine. The problem is a reminder about the math here. There's 2 of them and 30 teams, right? So like,
I'm going to tell you,
everyone just seems like it's a foregone conclusion. Everyone thinks like the Nets haven't done their due diligence by not going out and get these guys. Hey, do you think there's a reason? There's a reason only 2 guys. If someone wants to send me the other available guy that's on this list, which I know there isn't one and again, I know everyone's going to say Cousins. Cousins' numbers last year were like absolutely atrocious when he was with Denver. Like in terms of like net rating and stuff. The list is short because these guys just aren't available. I think the Nets would, if Miles Turner was like, hey, I want to come play for the Nets and you don't have to give up any assets to get him. Yeah, he would have already been here.
So here's one. I want to list one kind of sub concern to all these things that we're mentioning here as we hit the regular season. But on the Miles Turner piece too, one of my favorite things is, and this, I get it. Fans want to see this team be successful. But when you say something like, just go get Miles Turner, and to your point, competitive market for the guy's services, and then they throw in things like, hey, listen, Joe Harris sucks. Put him in there with his money. Hey, I'll give him Nicholas Claxton. He's not big enough anyway. Like when you start saying that your package to go get a guy that you think is the perfect fit and is the best available player involves sending out the garbage, quote unquote, that you don't like from the team.
It's classic. It's classic.
What do you think the other team is saying when you slide it across the table, right? Hey, I got a lemon over here in the driveway. What do you say you give me a Ferrari?
People can't help themselves. They just can't. Sorry to interrupt. They just can't help themselves. Like they don't see what they're saying. It's like, yeah, dude, of course, Miles Turner. Well, by the way, assuming he's healthy. Remember, he was hurt at the trade deadline last year. Like, assuming he's healthy. Yeah, everyone just wants to send out the thing they hate for the thing they love. It is awesome. It's amazing, and you can set your watch to it. Sorry to cut you off.
No, and that's so I always like to present that caveat. Like the Brooklyn Nets are not in the perfect position to go and pursue Miles Turner or any other key player you may think that improves this team in a particular facet. I also think, as we're listening to the concern areas here, guess what? Both Doug and I are still going to say, let's see how this progresses over the course of the start of the regular season. This isn't, oh, by the way, it's broken and we might as well light the entire boat on fire. My last concern, I will say, though, is in the process of things developing and getting better over the course of the season, one of my overarching concerns would be that it takes them a while to figure it out, and that maybe comes at the sacrifice of some wins and losses. You don't worry about the record so much as continuity. And by the time everything does start to click, we may find ourselves in a similar position in a competitive Eastern Conference of saying, hey, guess what? For the last 25, 30 games, this may be full go, a lot of max minutes from Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons, not being able to balance that between rest and the max loads we have to put on them. And if that's a big picture issue of coming into the playoffs and feeling healthy and feeling ready to go. That's an interesting ebb and flow to this season about new pieces, new components, and wanting it to work versus also knowing if the goal is still here to be high-level competitive in the playoffs, you have to try to strike that balance. I wonder how this team will approach dodging playing games and being established in the hierarchy that makes sense from a seeding standpoint to not find yourself in a really difficult first-round matchup.
Yeah, and that's kind of a bridge I'm willing to cross, like when we get further down into it. And I will say that in general, I agree on a high level with the size piece. Like, it would be nice to have another functional center. I guess where I don't want it, I just don't want these guys that always get mentioned, like Hassan
Oh, by the way,
Whiteside and
okay.
Dwight Howard. I know you don't either, but yeah.
No, let me do this a different way to close it out. I understand wanting to get bigger. I would like it too. But if you think that adding Miles Turner, when it comes to the idea of, and then give up Nicholas Claxton and give up Joe Harris and give up maybe another player too and some picks, the team after you make that trade looks dramatically different. Like, you're giving up very important pieces to Kevin Durant, to Kyrie Irving, to Ben Simmons, to bring in something else that you think improves them. This is not, we're a 90% team, we're an 80% team, now we're 99. You're sacrificing things to get that back as well. And I think that sometimes fans can forget that too. What are you losing to gain it? Not just the garbage you don't want on the team, quote unquote, but what legitimate components are you sacrificing? And then what expectations do you put on a Seth Curry, on an Edmund Sumner, on a TJ Warren when he comes back? All of a sudden you start to play with razor thin margins to make sure that you're going to be successful.
Yeah, and I do think, actually, and I'll close out on this, I do think that as the season goes on, we are going to see a new group of teams become sellers. Like, because right now it's hard to deduce who the sellers are. Like, we know that there's teams that are tanking. They really don't have a lot of functional pieces to even trade. OKC, Houston, right? Like, it's the Spurs. They've already pretty much done, I mean, Jakob Poeltl, but like a lot of these teams have basically shipped off their guys. We're going to see Utah ship off the rest of their guys. I'm not sure a lot of what they have left is a fit for what the Nets have. There is going to be another group that emerges here based on how this first half of the season goes. This is a transcendent draft. Like, there's going to be teams that don't think they're motivated now to lose, that will give them a half a season. Nets might be one of them. I mean, well, they can't really get to this point because the swaps, but like the
teas just put in the water.
Yeah, but it's not off the table. But there's going to be another group of teams that kind of sees them in the Wembanyama and Scoot Henderson kind of group of guys that they can maybe land here, specifically with Wemby, who is such a transcendent talent that you will see teams get like real gross about what they're going to do to increase their odds. There will be another team in here that is going to want to do it. They just don't know it yet, and we don't know it yet either. There could be another guy on the market here that Anthony Davis. I don't know. Like, Lakers have sold off their picks. That's not a good one. Anyway, we can explore this on another day, and I'm sure we will at some point.
Yes.
Because there's just a group of teams that think they're contenders now that are going to get 40 games in. They're like, someone got hurt. It's not going well. And now we have like some lottery odds at like what could be the greatest prospect since LeBron or like, Lou Alcindor or something like that. Yeah, they're going to start. You're going to see some teams start selling off for that.
By the way, a couple of the New York Knicks are a team that have a handful of larger bodies that may find themselves in interesting waters depending on where they stand.
Yeah, like Mitch Robin, Hartenstein, and stuff.
Yeah, like you're just sitting there saying, "Hey, do we need all these guys no matter what?" And then the price point changes on them as well. These are all things that are a little bit further down the road. I feel like this episode spent a lot of time on things that I don't feel like it. I know it. We intentionally had an episode about the concerns we have for the Brooklyn Nets, and these are things that now I want to watch over the next month of this team and seeing where it goes from here. A lot of them can go by the wayside. No, they're not the biggest team in the world, but that can be mitigated by the success that these units have on the offensive end and some of the versatility they offer defensively. It's just a matter of if it comes together. And you put a couple of breadcrumbs out there in some of your statements. Teams that are going to be sellers, like there's a real Armageddon world here that I think would be fun to explore, probably worth doing before the season starts because I don't want to be having the conversation in real time. But let's just say.
I'll give one right now. I'll give one. I thought of a better one. Chicago's a team that you can see, like, Lonzo Ball's hurt. They have no bench. Like they have Vucevic. Like, they're a team, DDR, and they just want to reset because those guys are getting old and they can't really do it. And all of a sudden they kind of stink. And like, because they're in a crowded Eastern Conference. And all of a sudden, and like, Lonzo Ball, who's a key part to what they were doing, is like, there's no timetable for him. We bet your life that Chicago makes the playoffs. I wouldn't. And if you're not going to make the playoffs this year, you better start losing early. Like, you need to commit to it early, because the marginal increase, even though they've really smoothed out the odds, the marginal increase on a chance at landing a guy who will legit make your team for like the next 10 years or more, like, you'll see teams, but we got to get out of here. But go ahead.
I know.
Last
Let's
thing,
get out of here. But I think but I think let's talk about that this week. We have Tuesday and Wednesday. The Nets are going to play again on Thursday. I think looking at the landscape of this NBA right now and saying like, hey, where are potentially some buyable low cost players for the Nets to improve this team as we get towards that trade deadline and we think about what could happen in next year's draft.
All right, we're going to get out of here as promised. Make sure you subscribe over on
One more
YouTube.
thing,
really, one more though. This is the last thing. Make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Really seeing the numbers kind of really just climb consistently and just to a point like about the closing music. My own closing music is blasting in my ear right now as a reminder. This is why I'm struggling through this as a reminder to just stop the podcast here. So even my own computer was like, dude, you're still going here? The music's going to start blasting.
I love my wife. I love my daughters.
Thank you, St. Louis. We are going to so make sure you subscribe over on YouTube, subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast, Apple and Spotify. Those are all totally free things to do. They really, really help us. The numbers have gone crazy for us in a great way entering the season. We're so pumped to start the season. And those are just free ways to help the podcast.
Doug Norrie stuck through me through the hard times, all those dark days when I didn't know which way was up. He was there for me, guys. Listen, it's a long season. A lot of things are going to get sorted out here. Patience, Iago. Patience. Jafar from Aladdin.
After a break, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again next week. Or no, it's going to be tomorrow. I screwed this whole thing up. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.